I had been a truck driver for 20 years, but nothing that happened that night had prepared me for what I was about to see. My name is Jack, and this trip started like any other. I had to deliver a shipment to a small town south of Chicago. The path led through a wooded area that always seemed a little creepy to me, especially at night. This time I left around midnight. The road was empty, only the light of the truck's headlights cut through the darkness. I always liked this part of my job. The solitude, the quiet sound of the engine, and the endless road ahead. But today something was wrong. I felt it after a few miles when my radio started jamming. Strange sounds began to be heard that did not resemble any station. Just as I was about to turn off the radio, I saw this, a small figure on the side of the road waving at me. It was a boy about 15 years old in an old, worn t-shirt. I didn't like picking up passengers, but something in his eyes made me stop. He looked scared. I opened the door and asked, "Where are you going?" The guy silently climbed into the cabin and I started again. He didn't say anything, just stared straight ahead. I decided not to bother him and concentrated on the road, but when I looked at him a few minutes later, he was gone. I braked sharply, not understanding what had happened. The guy was sitting next to me just a moment ago, and now he was gone. I turned to look around the cabin, but he had simply disappeared. It seemed that it was all fiction. I opened the door and got out of the truck, peering into the darkness. There was complete silence around, only the rustle of leaves in the night wind. "Hey!" I shouted, but in response, silence. I walked around the truck looking for any sign of the guy, but found nothing. Many thoughts were spinning in my head. How could he disappear so easily? Maybe I was just tired and gave up. But I definitely saw him. His eyes, so scared, were still in front of mine. I sat back in the cockpit trying to calm down. It was strange, but maybe I was just overtired. I decided to drive on, although I felt that something was wrong here. A few miles later, just as I was starting to calm down, the radio started to crackle again. I tried to tune it, but instead of music, I heard a whisper. At first, the words were unintelligible, but then I realized that the voice was repeating, "Don't let him go." I turned off the radio, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. It was the same boy's voice. I could feel my hands shaking as I held the steering wheel. I didn't know if it was a dream, a hallucination, or something else. But one thing was certain, I was not alone on this road. The road ahead seemed endless, and the feeling of anxiety only increased. I tried to focus on the road, but every sound, every shadow gave me goosebumps. I kept looking around, waiting to see something that could explain the strange happenings. Suddenly, in the light of the headlights, I saw a sign that I had not noticed before. It was an old, rusty sign that read, "Checkpoint." I knew for a fact that there were no stopping points on this road, but the sign pointed in the direction of a narrow road that diverged from the main highway. Not knowing what to do, I decided to follow the sign. Maybe there I will find the answer to my questions, or at least be able to rest. I turned onto a narrow road, and in a few minutes a small house, similar to an abandoned station, appeared in front of me. The lights were off, and the place looked deserted. I stopped the truck and got out, walking to the door of the building. They were half open, and I hesitantly peered inside. The room was dark, but I could make out some old furniture and tables. My curiosity got the better of me, and I entered. In the middle of the room, on the wall, I noticed a large screen with video cameras showing the road I had just come down. It looked like an old observation post. I raised my hand to the screen, and suddenly it came to life. An image appeared on the monitor, my truck, and a guy sitting in the cab. He was there again. But now his eyes were empty, and his face was distorted with a grimace of fear. My heart beat faster when I saw this image. The guy from a few miles ago is now back in my truck. He didn't move, just sat staring straight ahead as before. I didn't know what to do. Cold sweat ran down my back, and every instinct screamed at me to run away from here. But something in me wanted to find answers. I gathered my courage and went back to the truck. For a moment, I thought I was crazy, that it was all just my mind playing evil tricks on me. But as I approached the cabin door, I saw that he was indeed there. The boy was sitting in the same place where I put him and did not pay attention to my presence. I opened the cabin door, feeling the air around me seem to cool. "Hey," I tried to get his attention. but he did not react. Then I gently touched his shoulder and he turned his head sharply. His eyes, which I had previously thought were frightened, now looked empty, lifeless. His face was pale and his lips moved faintly, as if he were whispering something. I could not understand what he was saying and leaned closer. He kept repeating softly, "Don't let him go! Don't let him go!" I felt creepy and backed away sharply. At that moment, his hands gripped my wrist with incredible force. He raised his head and looked into my eyes. His face was contorted with an expression of pain and fear. "You won't understand. You can't let him go," he whispered. Suddenly, everything went dark before my eyes. I felt my strength leave me, and the last thing I remember is the boy whispering, "He's coming for you." I woke up in the dark. At first, I could not understand where I was and what had happened. His head ached with pain, and his arms and legs felt heavy as if paralyzed. Swallowing, I tried to concentrate, but my brain refused to work properly. Suddenly, I realized that I was lying on a cold, concrete floor. The light in the cabin was turned off, and darkness reigned outside the window. I tried to collect my thoughts, recalling the last moments before losing consciousness. The boy, his empty eyes, the words he repeated, what did it all mean? I struggled to my feet and took a few steps to the truck door. When I opened them, I realized that I was not in the same place. The road, the house, the night, everything disappeared. I found myself in a wide clearing surrounded by a dense forest. A light could be seen somewhere far away, but it was too weak and did not give hope of a quick rescue. After leaving the truck, I smelled a strange smell in the air, a mixture of rot and burning. It was so strong it made me nauseous. I walked slowly, not knowing exactly where I was going, trying to find any signs of life or a way out of this nightmare. But the further I walked, the stronger I felt that this forest was alive, that it was watching me. Suddenly I heard a whisper. At first it seemed distant and indistinct, but gradually it became clearer. Voices came from all sides, and they said the same thing. "He will come for you. He is near." I stopped, feeling a cold fear grip me. The feeling that I was not alone became stronger. I turned and saw a shadow. She stood among the trees, silent and motionless, but I could feel her gaze. She wasn't human. Her contours were blurry and her eyes glowed with an ominous red light. I took a step back, trying not to look at the shadow, but it started moving in my direction. Her every movement was slow and sure, as if she knew I wouldn't be able to escape. Panic gripped me, and I rushed to run, but the feeling that the shadow was steadily approaching did not leave me. She was always somewhere behind, waiting for her moment to grab me. Running was difficult. The ground underfoot seemed sticky, and every step required incredible effort. It was so dark around that I could barely make out the outlines of the trees. The shadow followed me, its red eyes glowing in the darkness like two hot coals. The feeling of being chased was so powerful that I could feel her cold breath on my back. I ran through branches that hit me in the face, leaving scratches. A wave of panic rolled through his chest, mixed with pain and fatigue. Thoughts swirled in my head. What kind of creature is this? How is it related to the boy, and what does it want from me? But there was no time to think. The shadow was so close that I could hear the rustle of her footsteps. Suddenly, almost tripping over a tree root, I saw a faint light ahead. It looked like the only hope for salvation, and I rushed in his direction. Running out into a small clearing, I saw an old, abandoned house. Its windows were boarded up and the door hung on one hinge, but the light made its way through one of the slits. I ran to the door and, mustering the last of my strength, burst inside. Closing the door behind me made me feel a little safer, but the fear didn't go away. I quickly looked around the room. It was an old wooden house filled with dust and cobwebs. A candle was burning on the table, which was the only source of light. On the walls hung old portraits of people with blank stares that seemed even more ominous in this flickering light. I went to the table on which lay some magazine. When I opened it, I saw that it was a diary. The pages were filled with illegible notes made in haste, but some phrases stood out among others. "The shadow comes every night. She takes our children. No one can escape from her." While I was reading, I suddenly heard a whisper. It was coming from somewhere below, from the basement. My heart was pounding with fear, but I felt I had to go there. It was the only place to find answers. Taking the candle, I carefully went down the old wooden stairs. The whispering grew louder, and when I reached the bottom, I saw an old door. They were locked, but a faint light shone from beneath them. I carefully touched the lock, and at that moment, I heard footsteps behind me. The shadow was here, and she was waiting. My heart stopped when I heard footsteps behind me. Every instinct told me to run, but the fear of the unknown forced me to stay put. The light coming from under the door was the only hope for salvation. I tried to open the lock, but it was strong and wouldn't budge. All my efforts seemed futile as I felt the shadow's cold fingers touch my neck. I jumped back, breathing heavily. The shadow stood at the end of the basement, its red eyes glowing ominously. She didn't move, just looked at me. I could feel her presence pulling me into the darkness, pulling me into a bottomless abyss, but something in me fought against it. I couldn't stop now that I was so close to the solution. I gathered my strength once more and pushed the door with all my might. They gave in and I burst inside. Inside was a small room in the center of which stood an old table. On it lay a pile of old papers and notebooks. But most importantly, there was a mirror in the room, large, ancient, with a cracked frame. It looked like something from another time, out of place. I approached the mirror, feeling something magical draw me to it. The room was reflected in its surface, but instead of me, there was a shadow in the mirror. She was standing right in front of me, and I could feel her cold gaze. Her face was blurry, but I could see it was twisted with anger. Suddenly, I had an understanding. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a soul stuck between worlds looking for a way out. Her words, "Don't let him go," took on new meaning. She was involved with a boy, and maybe he was the only reason she was still here. But how was all this related to the mirror? I reached for the mirror, and at that moment, the shadow in it howled. The mirror shook, and I saw her trying to get out. I retreated in horror, but it was too late. The mirror cracked, and I felt something cold and sticky wrap around my hands. The shadow was making its way into the real world, and I couldn't stop it. The room grew colder, and darkness began to fill the space. My only escape was to escape. But how could I leave this place when so much was left unsaid and understood? I felt that the answers were close, but at the same time, the danger was growing. The shadow was growing stronger, and her anger was palpable in every breath. The darkness emanating from the mirror enveloped everything around, creating a sense of hopelessness. I felt the shadow gradually leave the mirror, becoming a more real and material creature. Her presence sent the room into a cold nightmare. I saw the candlelight go out, leaving me in darkness. Panicking, I tried to find a way out of the room, but the door through which I entered was closed by an unknown force. I was trapped with this shadow. She now stood in front of me, her vague outlines becoming more and more like a human figure. An ominous whisper filled the room, mixing with the sound of a cracking mirror. "He's coming for you! You won't escape your fate!" The shadow's voice was low and ominous. I couldn't figure out who this he was that she was talking about. Could it be the same guy that disappeared from my truck? Or someone else even more terrifying? I knew I had to act or the shadow would consume me. I looked around at the papers on the table, hoping to find some clue. Among the chaos of papers, I came across an old magazine, on the cover of which was written, "Witness Records." When I opened it, I saw several pages filled with stories about the mysterious disappearances of people in the area. They were all connected to the same shadow. One entry in particular caught my attention. The shadow seeks out the vulnerable. It preys on their fear and consumes them. The only way to stop it is to reflect it in a mirror, make it see itself. I quickly realized that this was the only chance to save myself. I had to make the shadow look at my reflection, make it see itself. But how to make this creature, which no longer had a face, look in the mirror? My mind quickly ran through the possible options, and then one idea came to my mind. I grabbed the mirror, which was already almost broken, and pointed it at the shadow. She howled as she saw herself in the reflection. Her contours began to tremble, and she suddenly began to step back. I could feel my strength coming back to me again. I raised the mirror higher, trying to focus as much of the shadow's attention on it as possible. Her eyes, if you could call them that, widened, and she tried to run away, but it was too late. The mirror lit up with a bright light, and the shadow began to disappear, as if absorbed into its own darkness. And suddenly, it all ended. The mirror cracked and the darkness in the room disappeared. I fell to the floor, breathing heavily, feeling incredible relief. But as I lay there in the dark, I realized that this was not the end. The mirror was destroyed, but the shadow was only part of this nightmare. I felt that something bigger and more terrifying was still hidden within these walls, and I would have to find it to finally understand what was going on. Gradually, I gathered my strength, got up from the floor, and tried to orient myself in the situation. The sense of relief at the shadow's disappearance was quickly replaced by a new wave of anxiety. I knew that this place still held many secrets and that the unraveling of the whole story was still beyond my understanding. One of the folders on the table caught my eye. It looked older than the other documents and was covered in dust. I took it and carefully opened it. The inside pages contained handwritten text that was difficult to read due to faded ink, but what I was able to make out sent chills down my spine. It was a journal detailing research and observations of various anomalies in the area. Some records indicated the appearance of shadows several decades ago. Others talked about people who went missing after meeting her. However, one entry was particularly terrifying. Today we discovered a new creature that can control the shadow. It calls itself the Keeper. Only at night and always where there was a shadow. He takes the form of what man fears most. A cold horror came over me. This meant that the shadow was only a messenger of something bigger and more terrible. The guardian that the records referred to was a being capable of manipulating people's fears and using them against them. And if he really takes the form of the greatest fears, then what awaits me? I suddenly remembered the guy who appeared in my truck. His fear and words that I can't let him go. Perhaps he knew more about this place and about the Keeper. Perhaps he was related to him in some way. But how? With these thoughts in mind, I realized that the only place I could find more answers was upstairs, where I haven't been yet. As I climbed the creaky stairs, I could feel the tension building with each step. I didn't know what awaited me there, but I was ready to face my fears to finally solve this mystery. It was dark on the second floor, and I could feel the silence enveloping me from all sides. But this silence was not peaceful. She was full of anticipation. Something or someone was waiting for me out there in that darkness, and I felt myself approaching a truth that might be even worse than all my fears. The stairs creaked under my steps, and I felt my heart beat faster with each new step. The darkness on the second floor was almost palpable. It enveloped me from all sides. I tried to calm down, but the fear of the unknown mysteriously attracted and repelled at the same time. At the top of the stairs, I stopped to look around the room. It was a long corridor with several rooms leading off. Most of the doors were closed, and one was half open. The light from below barely penetrated here, leaving most of the corridor in darkness. I moved forward cautiously, trying to avoid the noise. Approaching the half-open door, I heard a slight rustling. It was the sound I dreaded the most. A sound that suggested something or someone was in the room. Breathless, I pushed the door wider and entered. It was a small room filled with old furniture and dust. In the center stood a table on which lay a pile of documents. However, that's not what caught my attention. There was a large mirror in the corner of the room. It looked as old and worn as everything else in the house. But there was something else about him, something that made me feel incredibly cold. I got closer and saw my reflection. But it was not just a reflection. Besides me, there was something else standing in the mirror. The figure standing behind me was similar to the boy I met earlier, but his face was contorted with horror and pain. His eyes seemed to beg for help. I turned around, but there was no one in the room. Turning back to the mirror, I saw him moving closer to the glass, his mouth moving silently, as if he was trying to say something. My heart froze when I saw his eyes looking directly at me through the mirror. He raised his hand and touched the inside of the glass as if trying to break through. I had the feeling that he was imprisoned inside the mirror. His lips were whispering something, and I finally caught the words, "Don't let him go. He's coming for you." I backed away from the mirror, realizing that the boy was somehow part of this whole mystery. But why was he in the mirror? And what kind of he should come for me? A terrible theory began to form in my head. Perhaps the Keeper I read about in the records uses mirrors as portals to enter other worlds. Maybe that's how the shadow appeared in this place. I looked up at the mirror and saw the boy disappear. Another figure appeared in his place. It was me, but not quite. My copy looked exhausted, angry, and worst of all, it began to move independently of me. The reflection took a step closer, his eyes filled with anger. It was my greatest fear to face my dark self, and now it has come to the surface. Suddenly, words came from the mirror, but not from the mouth of the boy or me. They were deep, ominous, as if they belonged to an ancient creature. You came. Now it's your turn. The mirror shook, and I felt a cold wave wash over me. I was on the verge of something incredible and terrible, and there was no turning back. After the mirror shook and my tortured reflection appeared before me, I felt the air around me become heavy and cold. The mirror reflected not only me, but also a part of my past that I was afraid to face. It felt like it was trying to pull me inside, showing me all the fears and mistakes I was trying to forget. My reflection spoke, and his voice was so familiar that I almost screamed. "You dreaded this moment," he said. "You've always run from your fears, but now it's time to face them face to face." I took a step back, trying to escape those words, but something inside me made me stay. I understood that this moment was key, that this was my chance to free myself from the past. I could feel the walls of the room, the house, the whole world around me starting to press down on me, forcing me to make a decision. "What do you want from me?" I asked, trying not to let the panic take over. The reflection did not recede. "You know what I want. I am you, your fears, your mistakes, your past. You must accept me or you will be here forever." I could feel the words piercing me like sharp blades. Accepting my fears meant admitting my weaknesses, admitting that I wasn't perfect and that past mistakes couldn't be changed. I realized that this very place, this house, reflects my inner world, my deepest fears and doubts. Looking deep inside myself, I remembered all those moments when I was afraid to admit the truth, all those times when I ran away from myself. The reflection stood silently, waiting for my decision. "Okay," I said, mustering all my strength. "I accept my fears. I will no longer run from them. I accept that I have made mistakes and I am ready to correct them." With those words, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The reflection in the mirror smiled and I saw his features begin to blur. The light in the room grew brighter, and I realized that this place was beginning to fade away, letting me go. "You made the right choice," said the voice. "Now you are free." With those words, the mirror cracked and I felt a wave of heat wash over me. The room I was in began to disappear, dissolving into the light. A light surrounded me and I felt reality shift. In the last moments before the light engulfed me, I realized that this house was only a symbol of my inner world. I had conquered my fears, accepted myself, and was now ready to return to reality with new understanding and strength. The light became blinding, and I felt everything around me disappear. It was the last challenge, the last step on the way to liberation. I did it with confidence, knowing that a new life was waiting for me. After the light engulfed me, I felt as if I had been ripped out of my body. I found myself in a space filled with radiance and a sense of infinity. It was unusual, as if I was swimming in a flow of energy where time and space lost their meaning. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of me. It was the same boy I had seen earlier in the mirror, but now he looked different, calm, almost joyful. He raised his hand, pointing into the distance. I turned and saw a series of scenes from my life flickering in this glow. They were familiar, but some of them seemed strange, moments I had forgotten or didn't want to remember. The boy began to speak, his voice echoing in this space. "This is your chance to understand what was real and what was an illusion. All these scenes are a reflection of your memories and fears. They shaped you, made you who you are, but you have a choice. Accept them or let them go." I watched the scenes change before my eyes. Memories of loss, pain, joy, and achievement. Each of these moments has left its mark on my life. I realized that they were all a part of me, and it was thanks to them that I became who I am now. I focused on one of the moments, when I was little and lost in the crowd during the carnival. It was my first great feeling of fear and helplessness, but at the same time, it was the moment when I found my way back, clinging to the hand of a stranger who helped me. I realized that even in the darkest moments there was light, there was goodness, and that supported me. The guy continued, "Don't be afraid of your mistakes and dark sides. They don't completely define you. You are more than your fears." I nodded, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. I began to understand that liberation is not only accepting my fears, but also accepting my entire history, with all its ups and downs. It was a moment of reconciliation with myself. The light around me began to thicken, forming a tunnel. I felt it was a way back. The guy was standing next to me and looked at me with a soft smile. "You're ready," he said. "Remember that true strength is self-understanding and self-acceptance." I took a step forward into the tunnel, feeling the light envelop me. It was a way to a new beginning, to a new understanding of oneself and the world around. I felt like I was leaving behind my fears and keeping only the things that made me stronger. I was ready for what lay ahead and knew I could handle any challenge. As I stepped out of the tunnel of light, I felt reality begin to return. The light gradually faded, and I found myself in a familiar place, in front of the house where it all began. But now he looked completely different. The house stood in the morning light, looking old but no longer scary. It was a place I no longer feared. I slowly looked around, feeling the fresh wind on my face. The air was filled with peace, and the world around seemed brighter and clearer. I knew that this was not only a physical exit from the house, but also a symbolic exit from my inner labyrinths. Suddenly, I saw in front of me a boy whom I had met before. He was standing next to the house, watching me with a slight smile. I raised my hand to wave to him, and he returned the same gesture. We looked at each other, and I felt like I understood him better now. He was my reflection, my past, which I had accepted and now let go of. The boy began to move away, dissolving in the morning light. I watched him disappear, leaving me alone. But now I felt no fear or sadness. I felt calm and confident. I knew that a new phase of life was ahead of me, and I was ready for it. I took a deep breath, feeling the freshness of a new day. A road opened before me that led to the city, to the real world. I started walking, leaving behind the house and all the fears that had once held me back. Every step I took was a step to a new life, to a new beginning. This trip changed me. I realized that it is important not only to fight your fears, but also to accept them, learn, and become stronger. I learned not to run from my problems, but to face them with an open heart and determination. And although this house will remain in my memory as a symbol of fear and trials, it also became a place where I found myself and my strength. It was the end of one story, but the beginning of a new one, and I was ready for whatever lay ahead.